Well, hi, everyone. I'm Colleen Benelli and here with my daughter, Robyn Benelli.
Hello, everybody.
And we are really excited to have as our guest again today, Nicholas Pearson. And we had him on our podcast a couple months ago talking about his amazing book, The Foundations of Reiki Ryoho. And you definitely want to check that out on his website and also on Amazon that you can get it or any of the local bookstores. Outstanding book. And we talked about it a lot in our last podcast. And Nicholas is also has tremendous expertise with crystals. So we wanted to bring him back to share his expertise, his information and knowledge, and the messages of the crystals. We always do an invocation before we start our podcast, and I could definitely hear in the invocation how the crystals also speak through you, Nicholas. So, welcome back again. We're so excited to have you here.
Well, thank you both. I've been looking forward to this. I'm grateful to be back so soon.
Me too. Well, I'm going to share a little bit about you before we get started, and then we'll have you share about your story. So, Nicholas Pearson is an author and Reiki teacher. He has written many books on crystals. He's also an award-winning author with his book, The Foundations of Reiki Ryoho. He began his Reiki journey in 2006, and he's trained in several styles and lineages of Reiki. He's also a certified medical Reiki master and a Let Animals Lead animal Reiki practitioner, and that is with Kathleen Prasad. And he also serves on the board of directors of Shelter Animals Reiki Association. Formerly served as a board member of the National Reiki and Healthcare Certification Initiative, and his book, Foundations of Reiki Ryoho, a manual of Shoden and Okuden, is available in English and Italian. Oh, I missed that part about Italian. So Nicholas offers seminars on crystal healing, Reiki, and flower essence therapy online and around the world. He's the author of 8 books and lives in Orlando, Florida, USA. We're going to be talking about a bunch of his books today, too. So as Nicholas, as we talked beforehand, please say the titles of them. But for all of you listening, his website is theluminouspearl.com, and you can find his information on Linktree, The Luminous Pearl, and then his email is nicholas@theluminouspearl.com. So you can find him all different places, social media, etc. So Nicholas, with all that said, and there's so much more to say about your bio, but I'd like you to just go ahead, if you will, and start with your story and wherever that leads with Reiki and with crystals.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for the introduction. Last time we got together, we really mostly focused on my Reiki journey. And there were a few links in the chain that would eventually point me toward Reiki. But ultimately, it starts with rocks. I think like a lot of folks who might be listening, I was that kind of kid where everywhere I went, I would pick up pieces of, the seashore, the sidewalk, the gravel driveway at my grandparents' home, wherever, like when stone spoke to me, I just listened. So at any given moment, if you turned me upside down, shook me, just rocks would rain out of my pockets. So I think around the ripe old age of 8, my grandfather had observed this trait for many years and decided to like get me a proper mineral specimen. And that's when I got my first piece of quartz, and nothing's ever been the same since. And I'm really happy about that. That piece of quartz, in no uncertain terms, changed my life. Although I didn't know it back then, it felt like I was holding this object straight out of a storybook, straight out of myth, something magical. I loved observing what light did when it passed through, and bringing a little magnifying lens up to it so I could inspect its internal landscape, and gosh, it was just magic. And I'd gotten bitten by the bug. I had to have more. So one thing would lead to another, and I'd track down every local rock and mineral shop or metaphysical store that would open up in my hometown in Southeast Florida. And I was an avid reader. And that's part of I won't say problem, part of the blessing, I suppose. My dad had a really strong science background, as did both of his parents. I wasn't raised in a particularly religious household. He was raised very, very Catholic, so much so that like he'd had enough for several generations. So when other families would do church on weekends, we'd go to the libraries when it was just him and me. And some weeks it was bringing home a stack of books on Egyptian mythology, or the Grimm's fairy tales and folk tales from all over. I love that kind of literature. But then the following week it might be earth science or marine biology or whatever science I could get my hands on that was age appropriate. And pretty soon things that were no longer age appropriate, because I'd read everything in the kids section. And looking back, I noticed something that's probably atypical but has served me well. I never found all of those fairy tales and studying world religions and mythology. None of that felt in conflict with science. Real early on, I started to notice that it was just two parallel approaches to understanding the world around us, and I could find the magic inside of the science, and I could also see what the science was that these myths were metaphors for. And that's just something I assumed was how everyone operated. I was very wrong about that, but I'm glad to at least have gotten that far. By the time I was in high school, though, I really just started collecting rocks and reading every book that I can, and getting my after school job so I could afford more books and more rocks and other things, but mostly those. And around this stage in my life, I discovered that like reading about the folklore of rocks and minerals was not just a past tense phenomenon. When I could find historic books or little bits of folklore among the many other things I was reading, it always was so exciting that one of my favorite subjects existed here. But I encountered books on crystal healing in the local bookstore, and I thought, people still do this. This is fascinating. So I found in the world of crystal healing a chance to explore the science and the spirituality side by side, because I was always looking for the pattern. Like there's, for so many people across so many ages and so many places, speaking so many languages, how do we have such universal attitudes towards rock and mineral? How do we find similar patterns of belief with things of similar composition or structure or color? There's got to be something universal going on. So, my science brain wanted to try to decode that and find some patterns. And I think I've found some that are satisfying for now. I'll keep looking for more. But ultimately, by the time I was a senior in high school, my local metaphysical store invited me to start teaching classes on crystals. So there I was at the age of 18, 10 years of experience with rocks, not a whole lot of life experience beyond that. But I started sharing what I'd observed and what I'd learned from reading and practical experience. Shortly after that, I started doing crystal healing sessions with friends and some clients from the local bookshops. And then I went away to study music, and I really thought that was going to be it. Music was going to be my life. I was going to let this be a little detour into the world of the magical, metaphysical, and mystical every now and then. But something really unusual happened that first semester that I went to university, as part of my tuition assistance was the federal work study program, and I was assigned to work at this place called the Gillespie Museum. I had registered for this school late. It was not my first choice. I'd fallen in love with another program that was far more competitive, and I think would have chewed me up and spat me out right away. So I went to the smaller school that offered me a lot more scholarship money, because that's an important factor in those decisions. And it was a beautiful campus in Central Florida. And wouldn't you know, when I finally realized, it's like the inner Capricorn kicked in, and it was like, if I go to this place and do whatever they ask me to do, they'll pay me, and that's great. So I'm just going to go do this. I'm sure it's for the art kids. I'm in the auditory arts, so visual arts. They're next door to each other. We'll just do that. And so I go to an upperclassman, and I ask him, like, so where is this Gillespie Museum? And he just gives me the strangest look, and he goes, the Gillespie. Why on earth would you want to go to the Rock Museum? And I just stood there wide-eyed and slack-jawed. We have a what? I need to know everything. So after rehearsal, I marched my way down, and of course it was closed. It was after hours. But I made sure to send the associate director a thoughtful email. And I thought, well, maybe she doesn't check her email right away, because in that era, people didn't. So I left her a voicemail. And I thought I'd just show up as soon as it opened the next morning anyway, because I didn't have class at that time. So I did. And I met the associate director, and I said, my name is Nicholas. She's like, oh, yes, you called and emailed. Welcome. Yes, we'd love to have you. And so from that moment forward, I got a chance to just dive headfirst into earth science and learn the hard way about chemistry and crystallography and geology and all kinds of things. And that's when I really started seeing those patterns emerge, the connections between the energy and the composition and the structure and all these other related things. It was also about the time that I was doing a much deeper dive into crystal literature and really comparing my experiences to those other ones that were out there. And it took off. Eventually, I left the School of Music for science, and then other things happened. I almost moved to Japan for unrelated reasons, and ended up in corporate America, and then took a leap of faith to write my first book, The 7 Archetypal Stones. So that was in about 2014, and the rest is history, as they say. That book came out in late 2016, and before we'd even started editing it, it was like the dam burst forth, and all of the ideas I'd ever had about rocks suddenly wanted to be written down. So I followed that up with 2 more books the following year. One called Crystals for Karmic Healing. For the crystal lovers out there, you might recognize the name Judy Hall. She wrote the foreword to that. She's the author of the much beloved Crystal Bible series, as well as easily 40 or more other books. And then came Crystal Healing for the Heart, one of my favorites. And then my 4th book was my Reiki book, Foundations of Reiki Ryoho. And I managed to keep on with the writing with Stones of the Goddess, Flower Essences from the Witch's Garden, Crystal Basics Pocket Encyclopedia. And then the next one to come out will be Crystals for Psychic Self-Defense, which is coming right at the beginning of 2025. So if anyone wants to, find those books, go visit your local bookstore. You can find them on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. If you're in the UK, check out Waterstones. And I've got details for all of them on my website, theluminouspearl.com. But, rocks have been such a big part of my journey. They're always with me, whether I'm teaching Reiki or whether I had a corporate job. It was still like such an important foundation. It was, the literal rock I built my life upon.
So I'm really interested about some of basics is a hard word to use. So I don't think it's really basics, because I imagine that it's so in depth and can be so nuanced with so many different aspects. But you combine mineral science, you combine lore, or I guess, ideas, I would imagine, from ancient texts as well about crystal healing, and then the idea of like how we think of modern crystal healing. So I don't know if there's a stone that you want to, or gemstone, whatever the right term is, that you want to, can you give us an example? I think maybe quartz would be a really easy one, but if there's a different one that you would like to give an example of how that intertwines.
Yeah. So, I mean, quartz, I think, is a good place to get started because we're all probably going to be familiar with it. Um, quartz is this really ubiquitous part of the Earth's natural terrain. It is arguably the most abundant mineral in the Earth's crust, as long as we categorize things by singular species and not families. And because of that, it's accessible just about everywhere. I have specimens in my collection from all 7 continents. I only have one rock from Antarctica, and it's a piece of quartz. So the thing that we find, if we go to some of our earliest written evidence, which stretches back a lot farther than people imagine, the first document that could be described as like the prototype of a book, of course it was written on clay tablets instead of paper, is I think a Sumerian text by the name of Abnu-Shikinshu, which more or less translate the stone whose name is, and then you fill in the name and then a description of it. So like the first book probably that we know of ever written is about stones. So this is like a really, really long tradition. I am but one of many human beings who've written books on rocks over the last several thousand years. But if we look at something like quartz in some of those early documents, and if we compare that to traditional and indigenous wisdom that may only recently have been written down, but is written in older things, we find a lot of themes related to light. We see it sometimes described as some sort of substance that is permanently frozen, water that is transfigured into ice that never melts, light itself that becomes solid, breath or spirit that also, congeals into something with form. And, there is a kind of crystallization in its imagery, not just because that's what it is, but because it signifies this end process of refinement, of taking something that might be a little less firm and allowing us to understand the form that exists within the formless and vice versa. So, in folklore, apart from all the kind of optical and light related imagery, quartz is touted as a panacea, depending on which time frame and where in history you're going to find people using quartz to heal just about anything you can imagine, whether it's pain relief or spiritual afflictions, maladies from ghosts and goblins and things that we believed at one point were the source of all illness. Quartz is really there to kind of take us to the causal origin. Now, if we look at how quartz forms, if we take a look at some of those processes, there's like a little kernel of truth, as long as we treat it poetically and not factually, in those stories about quartz being permanently frozen water. The majority of fine crystalline quartz, a piece like this, are created through a process that is described as hydrothermal. So it is a primary mineral. It forms from the cooling of molten rock and its byproducts. And sometimes one of those byproducts is superheated water. And I'm not just talking like it's boiling. Because there's no space inside the earth for it to expand, there's not enough open pockets because it's solid ground. When this hydrothermal fluid seeps and sneaks its way between the cracks and crevices in other rock, it is hundreds upon hundreds of degrees hotter than boiling Celsius. And that allows it to dissolve other minerals along the way, to capture them. And eventually it finds space where it can expand. Eventually it finds a pocket large enough for it to exhale, if you will. And as it does so, it begins to deposit those things that it's picked up. So we have this fluid force coming from a superheated, super pressurized environment. And as it gets to alleviate some of the energy that it has carried in the terms of pressure and heat, it leaves behind these beautiful crystals. So, quartz invites a sense of clarity. It has some really unique optical properties, as well as a bunch of other really fun properties. This idea of it interacting with light is not just because if we have a nice rough piece or polished piece, it makes a beautiful prism, but it actually interacts with light in some pretty astonishing ways. If little packets of light energy, we call them photons, if they pass through quartz in this direction from base to tip or vice versa, but just parallel to the central axis of the stone, all of those little packets of energy, which normally face every which direction, because they are electromagnetic in nature, we can think of them as having like a north-south pole, an electrical pole, and an east-west pole, a magnetic pole. And, ambient light is bouncing off of every surface and is facing every which way, but quartz acts as a polarizing medium. It takes all of those north and south and east and west axes and lines them up. That's astonishing enough compared to how many substances don't do that, but quartz does something weirder. It introduces something called a rotation, an axial rotation to those photons. And so they begin to twist and move through it like a helix. So that optical rotation of light is not found in quite as many substances, but that same kind of spiraling shape that they take, some authors have likened to the helical twist of our DNA, and the movement of energy at vortices around the world, which we today visualize as spirals, and other things that Reiki practitioners might be familiar with that also have spiraling forms that symbolize energy and its movement. So it's just really second nature to want to combine all these things to see how they kind of nest within each other and help inform a bigger understanding of what something can do. And, in truth, ask any crystal healing expert, and they're going to tell you that quartz can be used for anything. It is a broad spectrum tool. It does a little bit of everything, and it does it quite well. It's not jack of all trades, master of none. It's jack of all trades, and it's mastered them too. That allows us to partner with it, to collaborate with it for just about any aspect of our lives.
Well, and quartz is used in industrial purposes, which is, I know that seems unrelated, but at the same time, it doesn't. It's really interesting that it's, like you said, it's such a jack of all trades.
Yeah. So one of our most important uses for quartz in technology today is as an oscillator. So if we take a sliver of quartz, and it has to be of requisite purity, so it has to be free of contamination at a molecular level, which you wouldn't imagine it, but most things that appear to be pure quartz are very far from pure because we can't see those tiny anomalies with the naked eye. So nowadays, instead of trying to hunt down for things that are near perfect in nature, they just grow it in a lab. It's easier that way. They can eliminate the imperfections. But if the quartz is of high enough purity, and you cut this little tiny sliver of it at exactly the same angle relative to its axes and to the same thickness, then one of its other unusual properties will cause it to behave the same way every time. So quartz and many other minerals have a phenomenon in them called piezoelectricity. It comes from the Greek word piezin, which means to squeeze. So the idea is that when the crystal lattice itself undergoes mechanical deformation, if you were to squeeze or stress or stretch out the molecular structure of it all, it generates an electrical charge. Tourmaline does this, apatite does this, kyanite does this, lots of other minerals do too. But we can apply the same principles in reverse. If we add an electrical charge to a quartz crystal, then its lattice deforms. Now, if we've cut everything to precisely the right angle, the way it deforms is by oscillating, or less technically, it wiggles. So, every device that needs to keep track of time, our mobile phones, our computers, our watches, clocks that hang on wall. If you've ever noticed a lot of clock faces have the word quartz on them somewhere, that's to show how dependable they are, because at one point we didn't have this to depend upon. But that quartz oscillator gets zapped by its power source, the battery, or if it's been plugged into an outlet, and the precise number of wiggles it takes is how we keep track of the passing of seconds and minutes and hours and days with any of these devices. It's a part of a broader skill set that we can call transduction, which is like translating energy from one state to another. And this kind of parallels how crystals work, because they also are transducers or translators of energy. They can take that internal spiritual energy and translate it into the energy of the universe, the energy that the cosmos speaks. They can help translate between the small self, the individual self, and the individuated part of us that is not separate from that divine mind. And they become this spiritual oscillator that broadcasts the right signals back and forth to make those connections at the soul level. And meanwhile, most of us are blissfully unaware that that is one of the mechanisms taking place when we're working with our crystals. We just know that when we meditate with them, we feel better, or we can use them in grids to manifest something or accelerate our healing. But understanding the optical nature, the structural nature, the chemical nature of these tools also gives us clues as to not just what they do, but why they're so good at it.
I love that. That was going to be my next question. Okay, well, how do those facts, that part of it, apply to the spiritual aspect of it? So yeah, thank you for including that.
My pleasure.
So a couple of things. One was, would you say then that Reiki would also be one of the energy transmitters then that quartz can work with really well as a power source? Is that?
Yeah. So, if we go back to the original documents, of which we have few related to the system of Reiki, in the Kokai Denju Setsume, or in the explanation of open teachings, Usui explains that all things in the universe possess Reiki. So crystals have Reiki within them. Our bodies do. Every particle of air that we breathe has this spiritual quality to it. So if we are in tune with or attuned to that specific, we'll say, wavelength or frequency of energy, although I like to think Reiki more as a phenomenon than an energy, just because it doesn't behave the way Newtonian physics says it ought to all the time. But certainly we could become aware of the presence of that in anything. Crystals being such clear oscillators, they have such physical structural integrity that they also have the same kind of integrity in their energy. I think it's easier to become aware of the energy of a crystal than, say, the remote control for your television. It's just one substance, and it is that one substance as perfectly as possible, as perfectly as nature can make it. So it's easier for our consciousness to find the subtlety in that, find the nuance in that, become aware of the indwelling Reiki in that, especially when we're already Reiki practitioners. And certainly we know, at least going back to the mid 1920s, that Usui himself made use of quartz spheres. So back in the 90s and probably into the early 2000s, not exactly sure off the top of my head when Frank Petter befriended the Ogawa family, but he corresponded with the younger Ogawa, whose father studied Reiki with Usui Sensei in the 1920s, and he learned that Usui would give Reiju, would give like the prototype of our modern day attunement, initiation, ignition, whatever we call that, to quartz spheres. And they would be able to broadcast that Reiki frequency accordingly. And we have so many traditions around the world today that use crystal grids with Reiki, that give some form of Reiki blessing or empowerment to stones for healing. That the great thing about the nature of crystals is that they're very good at retaining an imprint, or we'll say that they listen and remember better than we can. So whatever the instructions or whatever invitation we give them to collaborate, whether that's through Reiki or some other tool, they're going to be there to support that. But I have a theory that I don't think I've shared very much publicly about why Usui specifically chose quartz spheres and not some other shape of crystal. And it's kind of it's almost like a pun in Japanese if we can look at the nuance of it. Sadly, I'm unprepared to show you the characters side by side, but the first things written in the Japanese language, the first time the native language of Japan was written with Chinese characters, is probably a better way to say that. They came up with two documents about one generation apart. One was called the Kojiki, the Ancient Chronicles, and the other one was the Nihon Shoki, about, I want to say 2 decades or less later. And in them, the challenges of writing these abstract concepts in Japanese that often had more than one pronunciation to them and that changed on context, and trying to marry them to Chinese characters didn't always work one for one. But there is a word that I'm sure all of our Reiki practitioners are going to know that refers to the soul. And nowadays we write it with the same character that's on my shirt, Rei, but it can also be pronounced Tama. And there is an old kind of association by sound, association by homonym or homophone in Japanese. So they would substitute words that sounded the same that would echo different aspects of something. So you could write the word for soul with the same Rei in Reiki, or another word that can be pronounced Tama or Kon that also means soul or spirit. But you could also use words like one that, if we translate it directly, means jewel, and another that means sphere. So we give Reiju to humans because it is a soul blessing from one soul to the next, really from like the cosmic soul through us to the next. So we can do that to quartz when it's spherical because it also possesses Tama. It is a jewel and it is spherical, and like all things, has that soul imprint. So I think it might have been a clever linguistic joke that is lost on those of us who don't read ancient Japanese, myself included.
Well, I think that's also fascinating. I think I in my memory, I have not actually read anything or heard anything with as definitive of understanding of Usui working with crystal spheres. So that's new news for me.
Yeah, it's not widely discussed. I want to say it was in one of the books that Arjava co-authored. So maybe it was The Spirit of Reiki that I saw it in first. If not, it might have been in Reiki Best Practices, but around that time frame, so like early 2000s, when these books were coming out, collaborations between him and Walter Lubeck, and of course William Lee Rand on the one. And I've seen a couple little historical references to it here or there, but even in the Jikiden Reiki Institute, this practice is preserved, presumably because Hayashi Sensei must have learned the concept of giving reiju to objects. We know that Hayashi did this to Gokai scrolls that he gifted, as well as to certificates, which is why we have so precious few of those things, because people made use of them practically. They noticed that they radiated Reiki. But several of the teachers I've met in the Jikiden Reiki Institute also perform Reiju, specifically on clear quartz. It doesn't have to be a sphere shaped, but they generally don't do it to other stones, just because the tradition was they did it this way, and so they continue.
So, Nicholas, can I assume that you have, I shouldn't say can I assume, but have you given attunements to some of your crystals that you use for yourself or for others? And do you go about that in a similar way to an attunement that you would do for a person?
Yeah, so when I first received my third degree, my Shinpiden training in 2009, Takata style lineage, as well as the Usui Tibetan Ryoho that I learned that same year, one in Japan and one here. And I didn't feel ready to teach. I knew that I wanted to. I thought I was going to take those classes and just start teaching. And the best laid plans of mice and men, as they say. Spirit said, no, you got to live this for a while. So I wanted to make sure that all of the practice that I got from, especially my teacher, Patricia, didn't just like go out the window. So once a month or more, every single month, I would practice giving Western style Reiki attunements to a crystal skull. I chose that because it has a face, and therefore it felt like I was practicing with a person. So I'd sit him on my office chair, same one that I'm in right now, in fact. And although, obviously he sat a little lower in the chair than a human being would, since he's just a head, not attached to anything else, I would pretend. And I would practice every initiation for every level of Reiki. in the lineages that I'd learned at that point, on one appointed day every month. And that probably went on for, oh gosh, I would probably say 5 or 6 years. I would take the odd student here or there. I wouldn't teach like an actual class until probably about 5 or 6 years would go by. And I didn't change anything except that my hands were largely over empty space with, a large piece of quartz in the chair somewhere below them. But over time, I started to experiment with other things. I can't account for how other lineages do this, but when we perform the kind of kokai reiju, the open style reiju that isn't conferring a specific degree or level, isn't so-called attuning us to symbols, but is this kind of general blessing that builds the more we do it. Those I find easier to adapt to giving to stones, because we don't really attune a crystal to a level. It's not a practitioner whose name goes on a certificate. It's about imbuing it with this strong connection. And I honestly think it's more about imbuing us with the recognition that connection's already there. Much like when we give them to people, we got to do the same thing. So I kind of just organically go through the motions depending on the format of reiju or initiation that I'm giving. If it's something I can hold in my hand, I prefer to do that. And so these days, when I do teach Reiki, I do kind of similar things. People, their certificates receive reiju. In the third degree, when I give everyone copies of the Gokai, a little print of them, I give that reiju as well. And then I hesitate to say this out loud because I have a finite supply, but at one point in 2020, I was able to find an ethical supplier for polished pieces of Kurama Ishi, which is the granite that the mountain is made out of. And so I have a bunch of little tumbles that I give my Reiki Master students. And so each one of them gets a piece of Kurama mountain that's been given Reiki or been given a Reiki initiation. So they get one crystal pre-attuned. And that's just something I've kept up for, the last few years since I've gotten access to that.
So as I've understood quartz crystals, and is this true for others as well, that quartz crystals, one of the main reasons that it works really well for us is that it is a completely neutral stone. It doesn't have its own agenda or properties. And the idea then, do others have specific properties and specific qualities, I guess we could call it?
Honestly, I think quartz does have its own properties, but because it is the most widespread tool that we might compare other things to, it becomes our baseline measurement, and so feels neutral to us. But if we look at what it's made out of, it's alpha silicon dioxide. Silicon has a very specific energy kind of signature to it, as does oxygen, but there's plenty of that in us and around us that it feels more common. But minerals that contain silicon, especially when they contain a high amount in the form of silicate minerals and oxides of silica, like quartz, they produce a kind of connection within us. They highlight the innate connection between the material and the spiritual. They help us understand how each one shapes the other. They become amplifiers and moderators of the flow of energy. And because silica itself is one of those building blocks of the geological universe, at least, we kind of treat it as a neutral base, but we can come across things that don't have silica in them at all, like carbonate minerals and sulfide minerals and oxide minerals of other substances. So I think everyone has its own kind of signature to it. But quartz, for its prominence in human history, our length of time that we have collaborated with it, extending back by some estimates, maybe as far as 450,000 years, so pre-Homo sapiens, we are just so comfortable with it that whatever its agenda is, whatever its personality is deeply linked to that of humankind. But when we start to look at every crystal, I think we start to see that Maybe some are more specific in their ideal focus. But there is this shift that takes place, I think, when we meet crystals where they are often enough and for long enough. We start to notice that the textbook definitions don't matter quite as much to us. And I say this as someone who writes those textbook definitions. So by all means, please go buy the books and use them. But also recognize that that's only a piece of the picture. In a lot of the work I do, I describe myself as a kind of feral animist. I don't like to abide by rules that are strict and dogmatic. And I'm just going to do my own thing within reason. It's going to be informed by, experience and a reasonable amount of sense some days. But I see the world as inherently inspirited. Whether we conceive of that as soul or consciousness or mind or Reiki, that spark of the divine is in all things that have form, including the forms we cannot see, including the kind of energetic forms that are beyond the human realm of perception, our ordinary realm of perception, at least. So in that sense, every crystal is inspirited. Every crystal has its own consciousness. So when we pick up a piece of quartz or a ruby or some hematite, we can commune with the kind of individual persona or perspective of this one specimen, but we can also, on account of the clear links that crystals have to the bigger picture, because they don't have personalities in the same sense we do. They don't have like an ego as a roadmap. They have a more collective consciousness. We can also tap into that greater field of consciousness that is the sum total of all quartz. We might call that the oversoul or the deva or the demiurge of quartz. And the more we become aware of that spark of consciousness in stones and work with it intentionally, the less we have to worry about what something's preferred job is. And this is a lot like meeting people. When you meet someone in a professional setting and they become your accountant, you go to them for tax advice. You don't go to them when you have a clogged toilet. You don't go to them when you need to mow the yard. You find a different professional who does that. Now, if your best friend happens to be an accountant, you can probably ask them for tax advice. But also, like if you need help mowing the backyard after you sprain an ankle, they're going to be that person who can come to you and help you because you've built relationship with them. They're more than just the job class description we see on paper, because they're also multidimensional beings, people and crystals alike. So yeah, I think there is a really strong predisposition between the human quartz relationship, but we can get that out of other things. One of my favorites to work with is rhodonite, a manganese silicate mineral. And there are a lot of parts of my life that I find rhodonite supporting me in, even when I don't ask it to, that don't match the standard descriptions that you would read or that I would write in a book, because we have that soul level connection, just like your best friend is going to help you with more than just whatever their day job is for.
I like that. I know that, Colleen has talked about this as well, but I have a pretty intuitive practice with crystals. And what's interesting, and what you're saying too, is that if you're in a crystal shop, just using that as an easy example, and there's one that you're drawn to, it's like you can use it for a variety of things, but I also like to look up the properties of that crystal, because it's like, okay, why am I drawn to this? What is it that's speaking to me about the properties of this crystal that maybe I need assistance with? And then also the reverse can be true. It's like, okay, well, I have this going on. Is there a crystal that can help me with this issue, that can help with the healing or the empowerment is a part of my practice? But that some people will, especially if you're new to it, be very concerned about what exactly do I need? And there's nothing wrong with that. So I don't mean it that way, but that also it's like, well, I just have more of like what I'm going to be drawn to, and then kind of look it up. It's like, why am I drawn to this? And then you see the properties and you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And that can shift too. You come in and out of relationship with your crystals.
Totally. My favorite thing to remind people is that at the end of the day, we got to find something that we love. So if the textbook recommends a specific stone, just one for whatever situation you've got going on in life, you get to the store, you pick up every iteration of it available, and you go, I am just not fond of this stone. You're probably not going to do the work that you hope to do with it. So take a step back and be open to inspiration. And we have to remember also, as best as we might try as human beings to speak on behalf of the stones, we do not speak and write and communicate in the same language as them, not at the conscious level. So no crystal book can tell the whole story of what stones do, because we have some loss of integrity of that message in translation into English or any other language we're publishing in. And then it's also the challenge of like, how do we put the ineffable into words? How do we transcribe a cosmic phenomenon in a few short sentences that fit on a nice, neat little card that we can put in the basket of rose quartz or emerald? We can't. We're going to miss something. My last book to come out was a special challenge for me because it's a pocket encyclopedia with 450 stones. And they each get about this much room on the page to write about. My very first book is kind of the opposite of it. It's like a 300 plus page book that only talks about 7 stones. So, if we look up emerald in the pocket encyclopedia, it's like 10 lines. If we look up emerald in the 7 archetypal stones, it's like 10,000 words. So, big orders of magnitude, and in neither place do I tell the whole story. Yeah. So we're always going to have something that we can't quite express, some thread that branches off in some other place that won't fit in the container we're creating to communicate this. So I'm hoping anyone listening will feel empowered rather than feeling hopeless or confused. Go be empowered to just go listen to the energy. And if what you read in the book doesn't match, or what you see on the card in the store doesn't match, if that's what you're drawn to, start with that, because that crystal is speaking to you in ways that maybe you're not consciously aware of, you're not translating into words, but there's this kind of sympathetic resonance on an energetic level, and you're picking up on that connection. So that's a great place to start.
And sometimes also I'll pick one just because it's pretty and I like it. But what I have noticed before is that I'll grab a stone and not sure why I want it or need it. I have that connection, and then it's somewhere down the road that there's the answer to that of why did this stone come into my life, and it knew before I did. That's why it ended up as a part of my own toolkit, for lack of a better word.
Absolutely. I have so many clear examples of that happening in my life, but I can remember like one of those life-changing moments with crystals. I must have been about 14 or 15, and going to the only crystal shop in town, I think by this point. Maybe the second one had opened up yet. I'm not too sure. And I'd seen every crystal in every case in the shop except for just a couple. So I finally asked about one of those things I've never looked at, and I'm like, this one back here in the corner, the light's not really on very well. Can I see that one? And the guy behind the counter, he's like suddenly excited to show this to me. He's like, oh, this is Petersite. I think you're gonna like Petersite. And he puts it in my hand, and all of a sudden, now that I can rotate it in the light, it is just the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. It's like you took different colors of tiger's eye, melted them down, and swirled them together and let it congeal. And I knew nothing about it except that I had to have it. It was just so beautiful. And my parents eventually made that happen. Like for Christmas and birthday, the following holidays, I managed to get a couple pieces, and I'm just instantly in love. I have more than a couple pieces in my collection today. But it is one of those stones that has helped me in so many ways that initially I wanted because it was beautiful and unusual. And, here we are. I still love Petersite, and it's this stone that has a really chaotic birth process. It's formed by breaking other things down and putting them back together. And so it has a pattern in it that gemologists call chaotic chatoyancy. Rather than the nice, neat parallel fibers that give that shimmering effect in tiger's eye, it's broken up like a mosaic, but not very well matched. So some, line up this way, some bend and twist, some are crumpled, some are blue, some are gold, some are red. And it is that lack of continuity that I think makes it such a helpful stone when we experience change, because we can't always see how things connect. The swirling patterns of it gave it a nickname especially in the 90s, called the Tempest Stone. And it looks like swirling storm clouds on the horizon. And it is just like the best ally for weathering the storms in life. When chaos is happening around you, it helps you find the eye of the hurricane. So there's center stillness on the inside. So we don't let that chaos in, or at least we learn how to move with it. So we're not trying to swim upstream.
I've often found that crystals have their own, with their own consciousness, but I think they also select us. I have had several instances. I remember 2 different times in my place of business in downtown Portland, and suddenly I was just compelled to leave my business, go across the street, had no idea why, and there was just a random person with a blanket out and crystals on it, and a specific crystal said, "Hey, I called you over here," and picked the crystal up for it. This particular one, I didn't know why or what, and it ended up for my horse, to use on my horse. And it's barrel shaped, like blue Tibetan crystal, and had these kind of rough edges on one end. And I could hold it in my hand and actually massage his body with it. And he just loved this crystal. And after I was working with him with it, after he passed, it is always right here on my altar, but it hasn't had a specific use since then. And that was for years of use with him. And so I've had several others like that where I feel like they have specifically found me. And when we are imbuing crystals with Reiki in our classes and we're saying thank you, there's always this feeling of the crystals themselves have chosen to come to the surface and land with us to be able to contribute to wellness on the earth, and not just for people, but for the earth itself, but definitely for us. So have you found that where they have their own connection to draw us in, it gets orchestrated that we find them?
Yes. And, if I made decisions solely based on price tag, there are a lot of things that I'd be really mad chose me. There's been some things that I've seen that just, it's love at first sight, and it's not just because it's beautiful. It's not just because it's something that is textbook perfect. It's because it moves me. And quite a number of years ago, my dear friend Sharon, longtime mentor in the crystal world, she recently retired. She sold her business to its next generation of owners, and she just had the coolest rock shop I've ever been to, and I've been to them everywhere. So one of my first times that I came up to her shop in like the Gainesville area, northern central Florida. It's a couple hour drive from where I am. And we were going to do sessions together, healing sessions, and I was going to teach a couple small classes. She invited me to just go through the store, free reign to pick up anything I wanted to use in our joint sessions. And I found this gorgeous, smoky Lemurian crystal. The moment I picked it up, it was like the room got brighter. She could see it. I could see it. The crystal was luminous. And it wasn't like I just changed the angle and it caught light differently. Like it appeared almost to be lit from within. And she goes, "Nicholas, I think this one likes you." Like, Sharon, tell me something I don't know. So by the end of the weekend, I did 2 days back to back of sessions and classes. We had to have a conversation because this crystal was not in my budget, like not by any stretch of the imagination, given its size and quality. But she knew it had chosen me. So we made an arrangement. I paid it off over a long time. And I am very grateful that it is in the collection today. And then a couple of years ago, when my husband and I got married, she gifted me its mate. There was one other one that came from the same parcel, mined in the 1940s, and she had just the two, and she reunited them. So that was our wedding gift from her. So they both sit in the living room where we can admire them. And I'm thankful it chose me. But it required a lot of like mental gymnastics to justify making that happen at the time.
The other question I have is just ordinary rocks.
I was just going to ask the same exact question.
Yeah, it's like ordinary rocks.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Colleen.
I had probably one of the most profound lifetime lessons taught to me by a just regular street rock. I was walking on a track and it just yelled, and not even thinking about anything. It just yelled at me, "Stop." And I picked it up and it gave me this information because I was always this overgiver and didn't know how to have my boundaries with that, and also imposing it on people as well. And so this rock told me that I pull a cart, and I put people in the cart with no agreements about how long they're there, when they get in, when they get out, why they're there. And also sometimes I go by and pick them up and put them in my cart without them asking. So it gave me this whole long explanation about this cart and how heavy it was and how hard it was to pull and how it was really affecting, my well-being. And that was like the gift of a lifetime, because it wasn't something I could see for myself. And suddenly, when it gave me that image, then I was able to start working on what that all meant and how do I heal it? How do I still be me with my giving, but, managing the overgiving, which was unhealthy. And so anyway, and then Robyn, I know you wanted to ask about a street rock too.
No, I was just going to ask about street rocks in general. And I had to add into Nicholas that my daughter is a lot like you were. She's 7.5, and Colleen was chuckling too, because we just went to the other part of the state this weekend. And I mean, just pockets full of rocks. We do have to limit her to some degree with her rocks. We call her a dragon because she just likes to collect her rocks. And so anyways, but I did want to actually hear about, kind of what we would maybe call ordinary rocks, even though we know that they're not.
Yeah, I absolutely love this topic, and there's so many ways that we can cover this. So, for starters, the crystals that we use in our healing toolkit are generally speaking minerals. So a mineral is an inorganic, naturally occurring crystal, which means it has a regular composition and a regular structure. The building blocks of minerals are the elements on the periodic table. Now, rocks, on the other hand, are aggregates of one or more minerals. So if the elements are the building blocks of minerals, minerals are the building blocks of rocks, which means rocks are made out of crystals. There are some exceptions here. We can maybe circle back around to that later if it's necessary. We've got stuff like opal and obsidian and a handful of things that don't really qualify as minerals. But there's so much to unpack in a rock. When we hold a piece of clear quartz or a nice gemmy piece of sapphire, it's like a single voice. It is one crystal structure. It is more or less one substance. It can have inclusions, it can have friends along for the ride, but it's still, there's a kind of dominant energy. When we pick up a rock, because it's a mixture of all these different crystal structures coming together, instead of listening to a soloist, we're now listening to a symphony. We get a sea of voices. All those tiny crystal structures are contributing to the collective field. And our energy fields are very similar. The song of our liver is different than our kidneys, is different than our eyelids and our lips and our fingernails. So we are similarly a sea of energies that have to mix and mingle and synchronize. So picking up rocks and connecting to them can be a really wonderful exercise. On the one hand, they tend to be, depending on what they're actually made out of, more stabilizing, a little bit more diffuse in their focus, because rather than a single laser-like structure, it's lots of structures put together. But there's also, I think, a couple of important themes worth touching upon. One is our connection to the land. And, in the Reiki precepts, we talk about now in a temporal sense, just for today, we release our anger and our worries, and we really focus on this moment. But if we think about that spatially, not just in time, but in place, right here is where we release our anger. Right here is where we release our worry. Right here is where we practice gratitude and become diligent and humble and be compassionate. We're not going to wait until we're at a different set of coordinates. So when we connect to the stones of the land wherever we are, whether that's home or someplace we're visiting, we learn so much about being rooted in the now, both in time and in place. We learn how to sync up to the larger landscapes of energy, because there's a physical topography of the landscape. There's also an energetic one. There is an observable community and set of ecosystems at the material level, but there's also spiritual ones. And stones exist in all those layers of reality. So do we, but the stone remembers it at all times, and we don't. So learning directly from the land is so important. And one of my tricks for doing lots of travel is ordinary rocks. I have some are imported, some are things that I work with on a continuous basis that come from meaningful places, my Kurama granite and my Preseli bluestone and Sarsenstone from England and flint from anywhere. I just love flint. But I also tend to have something from my local landscape, because it helps me combat the sense of disconnection to what my energy field knows as home. Rocks tell stories. A good geologist, a good field geologist, can go into the field and tell you the story of the landscape by reading what's happening in rock and sand and soil and clay and silt. And I don't profess to be that skilled. I can tell you some stories. I read some of that language, but most of it I don't. I'll leave it to the experts with the fancy degrees and lots of field experience. But those are important stories that we sometimes overlook in favor of biological ones. But the geological stories are rooted in what we call deep time. They're cycles of time that are so long and so slow that generations after generations of humankind passes in the blink of an eye for a rock. And I think one other thing I just want to kind of circle when it comes to this topic is that we live in a world that is focused on consumption. And as spiritual people, I think a lot of us try to be really mindful of how we consume limited resources. Many of us do our best to, shop local and organic and, buy things that are environmentally conscious. And so there are more and more folks having conversations about the ethics of mining and extraction, particularly in the crystal industry. And it's a really big topic. It's one we could spend 2 hours on and really not cover enough. But in short, there really is no such thing. There is no magic pill we can take to find something that is ethically sourced, because unless you go and you find that mineral specimen and you know what your carbon emission is, what your energy footprint is, how much of the ecosystem you disrupted, whether or not you affected other humans and other living things, you can't know exactly whether or not something is so-called an ethically sourced crystal or not. So our goal, I think, is to ask meaningful questions and try to get things as close to the source as possible. Have things with transparent supply chains wherever we have that option. And also to remember that although the crystal healing industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry, it is also probably the smallest slice of the pie when it comes to mining and extraction across all fields at all times. And so, given that we are the smallest, quietest subset, we're also the easiest to scapegoat. So we've got folks who are on their devices, crying out against, the way the folks of places like the Congo are being treated, and how dare we buy Congo malachite and all kinds of other things. But the devices that they're using to cast these aspersions are actually the reason these atrocities are being committed in the first place. And a lot of the things that we find in crystal healing shops that come from places that may or may not be embroiled in conflict are what we call gang minerals. They are the accessory minerals for the search for these valuable primary ores. And in the case of some of the malachite mines in the Congo and the cobalt and calcite that they're selling, that stuff is going to sit in toxic piles to generate and poison the land over time, or the miners can turn around and monetize it and have another source of income, at least in some cases, that they get to control, that they get to set a fair price for their labor. And, it's actually a wonderful thing. It's born out of a terrible thing. So is it really ethical? Who can say? But if we want to sidestep all of that, we can work with the stones of our landscape. We can work with the crystals that are under our feet and in our backyard. And maybe they're not as glamorous as the finest ruby and diamond and emerald and amethyst, but they are no less powerful. So when I wrote the Pocket Encyclopedia, Crystal Basics Pocket Encyclopedia, I made sure to include as many common rocks as I could reasonably fit in. So we've got granite and schist and soapstone and marble and limestone and sandstone and a handful of others that are in there, because you probably can find some or all of these somewhere near you, whether they're local or they've been imported for landscaping. And those are valuable tools that we can use for a healing process. They have the same potential for wisdom and healing as the finest museum grade specimens. So for those of us who do sit with a complexity of like, what does it mean to extract these from the earth? What does it mean for them to be shipped around the world? What does it mean to have all this labor done overseas where we can't, ensure the integrity and the safety of the folks who are doing the work? Do the work yourself by going and picking up that beautiful little pebble from the creek bed. As long as we don't all take pebbles from the same square mile of creek, we'll be okay.
I love that, Nicholas. Thank you so much for addressing that. And like you said, it could be a very long conversation that we could have. It could be its own episode of the podcast. One thing I did want to ask about your, bringing home like a local rock, or like you said, from the creek bed, this wonderful spot on the river nearby where the river rocks are unbelievable and the cliff is cut out and you can see this, speaking of the striations of time. But do you ask the rock, like just kind of your ordinary rock, if it wants to come home with you? Like, what is that conversation, for lack of a better word, like?
So I think for folks who have an inspirited view of the world, whether you're a feral animist like me or like a really prim and proper one, it's helpful to acknowledge the presence in our tools. I tune in. It's not always consciously asking a question, but I tune in before I select a crystal from a website or from a shelf in a physical store, just like I'm going to do that when I'm, walking the seashore. And it doesn't always have to come in the form of question and answer.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's that magnetic knowing, your daughter knows. Maybe there's a little bit of dragon hoarding. I'm also still guilty of this. Fair warning, she may never grow out of it. I'm pushing. I haven't done it.
I think so.
It's a great thing. We love it, but it's more of, like you said, of, you don't have to take all of them. And also we make sure that she's, doing it in a kind of ethical way as well. From we were at the painted National Monument here recently. She's like, I want to take this rock and I want to take this rock. And we're like, well, if everybody took a rock, that kind of thing as well. We're conscious of that piece, but it's okay if she never grows out of it. She drew the right parents for that.
That's excellent. Yeah. As long as we are conscientious, I really am. I'm not big on rules, but I think if then statements can be helpful. So if we are mindful and respectful of the place, if we are open to stones telling us no, which again doesn't always come with hearing and disembodied voice shouting in your ear like, not me, I've still got work to do here. It may not happen like that, but if you're on the shore of the Thames at low tide in London and you see 47,000 pieces of flint, you don't have to go, oh my gosh, look, a piece of flint. Oh my gosh, another piece of flint. Okay. So, thankfully I have a husband to rein me in. He's like, Nicholas, how many pieces of flint do you need? And I think that's a trick question. I still haven't found the limit, but I carried enough to give away to people that I loved that day, and have a couple left over for me. And that was a good experience. In other cases, if the collection of geological materials is prohibited, like at most state and national parks, we should abide by those rules. Pick up a rock as long as it's safe to do so and you're not going to disturb anything or injure yourself, and sit with it and then put it back. Go visit with the boulders that are too big to move and listen to their stories. Sketch them, write about them. Compose poetry for them. They're going to love it. And then you're going to take that wisdom home in your heart and soul that is going to live on in your practice. Even if you don't have a shiny new rock to place in someone's heart chakra, it's still coloring your practice into the future.
One of the teachings I was given by a Nepali shaman when I was in Tibet was to always take 2 rocks, so the one rock had company.
I love that. This reminds me of something we did a couple years ago. No, just a year ago. I did a retreat in Glastonbury that I led with my best friend and a fellow collaborator and colleague and author in the crystal world, Ashley Levy. And for all the participants in the retreat, we requested that they bring 2 rocks from home. They could be from anywhere, but you had to bring 2 rocks from home. Any size or shape, just as long as you're mindful that you're carrying them back and forth. And they got to bring them to all of the sacred sites, and that at any point on our little pilgrimage, they would leave one behind and one would come back home for them. So they would always be connected, back and forth to those sacred sites. And, those 2 stones from the same landscape are like linked through quantum entanglement. So they're always capable of focusing on that connection. So this piece of Florida limestone is actually the one that came home for me on that journey. Its mate stayed over there.
Oh, I love that. Well, it was fun to watch Luna, Robyn's daughter, the other day with the rocks and how she was picking them, because she actually looked at each rock for the tool that it was. So one was a rock that she could write her name in the sand. It was an etching rock. Another rock was one that could push dirt. Another rock was one that could pull dirt. And she had just this little collection of probably 8 different rocks that each had its specific purpose. And, speaking of them, I feel like those are ambassador rocks. They are there for her, not just for her, but they became this entire imagination. And for her, they're now friends of hers.
Mm-hmm.
They're now part of her world, not just a collection that she tosses away and ignores. She knows every one of them. I don't know about all the little pebbles in her pocket. That was, the whole pocket full of pebbles. But I thought that was a really fun, just watching her. And then that's what I felt like those rocks were ambassadors.
And what a great model of how to let our stones teach us.
Yeah.
Like if we let go of enough of our stuff and we stop projecting what we think they ought to do for us, and we start listening to what they hope to get from us and how they can partner with us, and we start looking at those relationships, like those prepositions demonstrate relationship. So how can we shift that relational focus? And our crystals are going to teach us. And it reminds me a lot of Hawayo Takada's famous injunction, let Reiki teach you. Don't read it in a book and receive an attunement and listen to someone lecture and then we've mastered it. We have to sit with the practice. It's the same with our stones. I think really the only two skills that I've cultivated that make me have a leg up on anything in the crystal world is I really like patterns. I really like finding patterns. And so I work until I've got it. And sometimes it's really easy and sometimes not. And the other one is that I'm really willing to be wrong. I'm really willing for the stone to tell me otherwise. I'm hopeful that I'm going to get well actually from a piece of rose quartz one day. And as long as I'm willing to let them lead and guide and inform and inspire, so it's not the Nicholas Pearson show, it is the relationship between the stones and Nicholas, the relationship between any of us and the stones and the land and the spirits of sky and earth and sea and the cosmos, then we're going to be in the receptive state to do the real work, whatever that work is for us.
Well, you were talking about the ethical practice of mining the stones, and one of the things that the stones did tell me is there are many of them that want to come to the surface to contribute to this information, our knowledge, and our wellness, to provide not just healing for us, but when we heal us, we're also healing around us and, the earth itself. And they've been pretty specific about it. They're glad to land in our hands and be able to work in cooperation with us to contribute wellness into the world and on the surface. Like they are specific about wanting that job.
And it's not a new relationship. I think things are magnified, things are accelerated here in the 21st century, but there is nothing new under the sun. The very first industry ever is the mining of rocks, the mining of flint in particular. It's the beginning of human industry. And here we are, many thousands of years later. One of the most important industries is still mining and extraction. So I think there is a tendency for us to hyperbolize problems and to project, because it's a helpful distraction, right? If we can complain about this thing that is such a tiny, insignificant slice of the pie, then we can be focused here instead of on all the other things that we actually have power over changing, unless we work so collectively towards liberation that we just become an overwhelming force. And we're not there yet. We haven't reached the tipping point. But people feel like they can reach critical mass here. But it's such a complex issue. It's such a nuanced conversation. We do have to remember that life kind of hinges around it, at least life as we know it, and it also has for tens of thousands of years.
Such a good point.
It is, yeah, it really is. Nicholas, I know as we're kind of coming to time, I was just wondering if you have just a little tip, or this whole episode has been about advice. So, but are there a couple of tips or a tip that you could give people, maybe how they can use a crystal in their self Reiki practice? And by the way, for our listeners, follow Nicholas on Instagram because he's giving these like every day. So, and I don't know if you have a TikTok, Nicholas, but that's where I follow you, and you are a wealth of information, and he is very often giving out tips and tricks and advice and properties of different stones. But I would say maybe for self Reiki practice, or if it comes out that it's within the home or something that people could take.
Yeah. So, in no particular order, here are some helpful tips. Cleanse more often than you think you need to. Crystals have much better memory than humans. The nature of their crystal structure is to have memory. So there are lots of ways to do that. You can check out your favorite crystal books, whether they're mine or anyone else's, and they'll give you hopefully some good advice. And that's just good for us in general. Good spiritual hygiene makes for happy, healthy human beings. I think another really great thing to be mindful of if we're incorporating crystals into our Reiki practice is to prioritize things like comfort. Um, it is easy in today's world to go, oh, I need 1,000 different crystals because they each do something slightly different, and then I want to use them all at the same time. And that's not practical. That's going to be stressful. It's going to take up more time than the actual practice. So simplify and just focus on that comfort. What can you do with the most amount of stillness, the most amount of presence? If that's making a grid or a mandala or a crystal layout and that becomes meditation to you, do that. If you find that those things distract you from your hands-on Reiki practice, put a rock in your pocket and call it a day. Place one on your heart center and place your hands over it and give yourself Reiki there. So just, be simple and comfortable. And then, last but not least, I would say experiment. If we have an expression in the geosciences field, I've heard it said by more than one earth scientist, that the best geologist is not the one with the best degrees or who works in the most cutting edge lab. It's the one who's touched the most rocks. In terms of our crystal practice, the same applies. The most keen observers of rock and gem and crystal and mineral are going to be the ones who are the most sensitive to their energy. So this is where I'm giving everyone explicit permission to go experience rocks. Visit your local Earth Science Museum or Natural History Museum. Go see the local rock and mineral shows that come through. Play with the tumbles in your metaphysical store. Look at pictures of them online and in books. But most of all, just experience them as they are. And if you do that, you're going to know what's the right crystal for the right job, even if you don't have the encyclopedia with you or you don't have a chance to Google it beforehand. So if we get so hung up on making things perfect and idealized and all of that stuff, it's going to take us out of our Reiki practice. That's the beautiful thing about Reiki. We don't need tools, but it's also so malleable that it supports any of the tools we want to use. So don't let one get in the way of the other.
Well, I have a couple things, and this one just keeps telling me to mention, my husband does all this work too. And in one of his journeys that he did, rocks really came into it. He's also been a water pourer for sweat lodges, so working with the stones in that capacity too. But the rocks were telling him how that rocks are universal. All the planets have rocks. Rocks are everywhere and not just on the earth. And it's one of the substances that can be found everywhere. And then another one that I think about all the time, they were showing him how the different sizes of the rocks change a rock's experience. So a huge rock, of course, is immovable, unless it gets blown apart with dynamite or something like that. But the huge rocks are immovable, and all the way to the small rock that can get picked up and tossed randomly. And I've always thought about that when I'm engaging with rocks and their preference. So I've even found myself walking on the street and a rock ends up in the middle of the road, and I think, put it back where it goes. Doesn't want to live in the middle of the road. It wants to go live over there with the other rocks too. So that one, but also you have so many books and you have the new one coming out, and we can have you back to talk more about your new one. But Can you talk a little bit about the different books that you have and the new book coming out and what you talk about in them? I mean, you really have an incredible wealth of information here.
Thank you. So if anyone's looking for like a good, solid reference book, introduction to crystals, or an expansion of a platform with crystals you've already got, I'd say check out Crystal Basics. This one came out in 2020. It's got 200 different crystals inside. It's actually a 201st one hidden if you look hard enough. And it gives you the physical, psychological, and spiritual properties of all 200. And the first half of the book, about 200 plus pages, is all the how-to, what crystals are and how they form, how we can decode that geological language into the energetic language, ways to make grids, recipes for crystal elixirs, hands-on healing practices, meditations, you name it, it's got all of that. So that's probably a great place to get started. Last year, I also came out with a companion guide, Crystal Basics Pocket Encyclopedia. It has 450 crystals in it. So a lot more, but more succinct entries. And it's only got about 40 or so pages of the how-to because it's a pocket encyclopedia. But this one's got lots of tables and stuff in the back for correspondences, like crystals for the chakras, the planets, the elements, the zodiac signs, and so on and so forth. A couple little glossaries for some helpful reference. So those are like really good all-purpose tools. But some of my other books on the crystal world have like a particular focus or theme. So, for example, my next book to come out, Crystals for Psychic Self-Defense, is all about managing our energy. How do we enforce healthy boundaries? How do we deal with intrusive energy? A lot of books on the topic of like protection crystals keep things like really light, and I don't mean light as in ineffective. I just mean we're only going to focus on the positive outcomes and the positive ways that we can mediate these kinds of forces. But what do you do when you're in a more dire situation? What do you do when things are far heavier than that? What do you do when you have urgent need for some other level of protection? So I've got a few additional chapters to deal with that. It's got 145 stones in it. I think like 20% of them I've never written about in any of my other books, which was a special challenge I gave myself. And that's coming out in early 2025. I think we're looking at January 7th is the current release date in the US, and then other dates in other markets. I have a book called Stones of the Goddess, which is probably my favorite to write. It's 104 crystals for the divine feminine. So we look at the intersection between the mineral world and the veneration or acknowledgement of the divine feminine throughout human history around the world, and explore different practices that we can use to connect. It's certainly a more magically oriented crystal book. I've got Crystal Healing for the Heart, which is what it sounds like. It's gemstone therapy for physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being. That's not an A to Z kind of book. Every chapter has its own themes, like strengthening the heart, or learning to release this baggage our heart carries, how to communicate directly from the heart, how to allow love to be an alchemical force in our lives. And so the crystals are organized around those themes in every chapter, and there's some hands-on techniques for every topic. Crystals for Karmic Healing was like an accident. I started some other book, which I thought was going to be my second book. I've never finished that book. Pieces of it exist in many of my others, but it's never going to happen on its own now. But instead, I sat down one night and wrote an outline for a book I had no intention of writing, and 27 days later, I had a manuscript to solicit. So that one has, I want to say probably around 50 or 60 different crystals in it that really focus on helping us transform our future by letting go of those karmic and ancestral baggage that we can carry. And I think that takes us to the 7 archetypal stones. I don't think I've missed any, but 7 archetypal stones was my very first book, and it was also just a fun exercise. I wrote that for me. given the opportunity to rewrite it, it would look like a different book today. Maybe that'll happen at some point. But it was like the early culmination of some of my research at looking at some of the deeper recurring themes. If we look at the material and symbolic uses of obsidian anywhere in the world throughout human history, they tend to be very similar. Now, is that a reflection of humankind or the stone, or is it the result of the relationship between the two? I mean, I have my theory. But so I did that kind of exploration for 7 stones. Each of them are kind of like teachers, really deep teachers in their own right, starting from obsidian without a crystal structure, a really common substance, very amorphous and irregular in so many ways, and it culminates in diamond, which has an extraordinarily regular form and composition. It is the light to the shadow of obsidian. They're kind of like a bookends between there. But you meet a handful of other rocks and minerals along the way, from jade and lapis lazuli, emerald, quartz, and amethyst, and then finally diamond. So that's kind of a more abstract, esoteric work, but still a fun journey.
Well, I also want to again mention Foundations of Reiki Ryoho, a manual of Shoden and Okuden that you wrote too, because it really is such an excellent book on Reiki. And not only is the information good, but it's a good read. It's actually interesting to read too. So, anybody looking for more information about Reiki, to definitely go to his website and learn more about that too.
And also there's a flower essences book.
Yes. Oh yeah. Flower essences from the Witch's Garden. We can't forget that one.
Yeah.
Like, hey.
Totally. And you can find that all at theluminouspearl.com. But if you just Google Nicholas, all of that comes up. And like I said, definitely follow his Instagram, because you learn a lot there. Nicholas, are there other social media platforms that you would like to mention?
That's the one I spend the most time on.
Yeah.
Most out of that, I think there is a TikTok. I haven't opened the app in quite a long time, so who knows what's floating out around there. But there is some presence there. I'm on Facebook as well, but also as the Luminous Pearl. But I spend more time and energy on Instagram. That seems to be the platform that works with my brain the best, so I get the most enjoyment out of it.
Biggest dopamine hit from the likes.
So before we finish up, can you talk a little bit about your book, Flower Essences from the Witch's Garden, Plant Spirits and the Magical Herbalism?
This was my pandemic baby. I released Crystal Basics, and had a big tour planned. None of that happened, and life got kind of weird. But my schedule changed. I was working somehow more hours at my day job, just not public facing, and the arrangement of those hours was different. So it was really easy to have a consistent writing schedule. So it was one of those like aha moments in the shower. Literally, it was the cliche. I'm shampooing my hair, and it was like trying to come up with just something exciting to pursue. And I thought, I've been doing so much with flower essences that there isn't a manual for. What if I put all of that in a book? And I swear it was the most productive 9 months of my life. It is by word count, it is my longest book by a long shot. It's I think like 165,000 words, which is a lot of words. It's a whole lot. And it just felt effortless. So it's got a directory of 100 flower essences, whether you're working with them as those kind of energetic solutions, or whether you just want to work with plants in other forms. There's going to be some reference material for you. Plant spirit attunements and how to do plant spirit healing, and some formulas and all kinds of other fun stuff. That was another unexpected project, and honestly, when I was anxious about its release, because it's so different to the other things I spend so much time doing, it was like, I feel like I'm invading someone else's space. So I just wanted to make sure that I credited all the people that I learned from, and, had a really rich bibliography and thorough acknowledgments to ensure that I was paying it forward to the community that paved the way for me. But it was a really fun project to write.
Well, I would love to hear more about that too, because this is the second time now I have heard about flower essences, and I've heard about them before, of course, but this is the second time that it's come in at this level for me to recognize the highlighting of pay attention to this in a week. So flower essences haven't really been something I've focused on, but now I have a definite highlight. Okay, I need to get this book. And one of the avenues that came in was in one of my Reiki journeys, really discovering the nature of mycelia and how the mycelia is speaking to us right now, trying to get us to listen. So it has so much information for us with solutions. And so anyway, that's a whole other subject, but that led to this whole conversation about the flower essences as well. So now it's very highlighted for me. So I would love it if you would like to come back and talk about that part of your expertise and knowledge.
Let's do it.
Yeah, really fascinating. That's how it always works, right? We get these highlighted, hey, it's speaking. And that's where the mycelia, I have never had any kind of connection to it, awareness of it. And it came through so strongly in a session that I was doing for someone that it has now sent me on this whole pathway of listening and studying and asking it why and what and how, and why is it speaking so loudly. So the flower essences came in with that by someone else that we were doing this work together then. So
That's super cool.
yeah, so we'll schedule for that next time too, and then more about your book, your new book with the psychic crystals for psychic self-defense. That's a really interesting concept too. Yeah. So,
well, fantastic. Nicholas, thank you so much for joining us again. He also may have or may not heard, because he's been very good about muting, but he has a little bit of a cough as well. So we really appreciate you coming on and talking through that. Thank you so much. Again, you can follow him at theluminouspearl.com. And is your Insta Nicholas Pearson, or is it the Luminous Pearl?
At the Luminous Pearl.
At the Luminous Pearl. So yeah, go follow his Insta as well. And Colleen and I, of course, are at Reiki Lifestyle. You can find me at Robyn Benelli Reiki, her at Reiki Lifestyle. And then we do have some classes coming up in July and August, Animal Reiki, Human Reiki. So go take a look at our website and calendar for those. All right. Thank you so much, everybody.
thank you, everyone.
Thank you.